Rachel Myers had always believed that houses carried the weight of their past, absorbing the years, the voices, the triumphs and failures of the people who had walked through their doors. When she first stepped inside the old Victorian on Willow Lane, with its peeling paint and sagging porch railing, she didn't see a ruin or an eyesore the way her soon-to-be neighbors did. She saw a promise of renewal, something she could restore piece by piece until it mirrored not just her vision as an architect, but also her need for a place untouched by the chaos she had left behind. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, shaded by oaks that had seen generations come and go, and though the windows rattled when the wind pressed against them and the floorboards groaned under her steps, Rachel felt a profound connection the moment she crossed the threshold. Her career had once been the envy of her peers. In her late 20s, she had already worked on projects that reshaped downtown skylines, her name attached to designs that won competitions and corporate praise. But the firm that had devoured her 20s had also devoured her sense of self. Long nights under fluorescent lights, endless battles with partners who cared more about cost-cutting than integrity, and a constant pressure to produce brilliance on command had left her hollow. When she finally resigned after dispute over a luxury project that erased a historic neighborhood, she walked away with no plan other than to find something of her own to rebuild. The Victorian house, purchased with her remaining savings, became that anchor. It wasn't a grand purchase by suburban standards. The neighbors kept immaculate lawns, uniform shutters, and cars polished to gleam like showroom models. Compared to them, Rachel's house looked like a scar. The porch sagged where termites had long ago won a battle with the wood, the siding bore years of neglect, and the yard had been left to weeds. Yet to her, each imperfection whispered of work that could be done, a problem that could be solved, a detail that could one day shine again. She spent evenings sketching possible renovations, sometimes sprawled across the dusty hardwood floor with her mechanical pencil, sometimes leaning against the cracked plaster walls, imagining what they could become once stripped and refinished. Still, moving into that neighborhood meant more than buying a project. It meant stepping into a community that did not quite know what to do with her. Rachel was quiet by nature, the kind of person who found solace in sketchbooks and the rhythm of drafting rather than small talk over fences. She greeted people politely but without the effusive cheerfulness they seemed to expect, and she quickly felt the subtle shift in tone when conversations with neighbors drifted to her house. Their eyes would flick toward the flaking paint, the tarp covering part of the roof, the mismatched boards she had nailed to the porch for temporary stability. She heard phrases like, "It brings down the value of the block," spoken just loud enough for her to catch. Rachel told herself she didn't mind, that she had weathered far worse in the boardrooms of her old firm, but the truth was that the neighborhood's scrutiny settled on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Every time she hauled bags of debris to the curb or scraped paint from a shutter, she felt eyes on her, judging not just the state of the house but her right to live there at all. She knew they whispered about how an unmarried woman in her mid-30s could afford a property here, how she seemed to work odd hours and kept to herself. Rumors in suburbs had a way of mutating into fact, and though she tried to ignore it, she sensed the disapproval building quietly, waiting for someone to give it a voice. At night, however, when the street grew silent and the only sound was the creak of the old trees outside her window, Rachel felt something like peace. She would light a single lamp in the front room, spread her drawings across the table, and let herself believe that she was safe inside these walls, that the house could shelter her from the exhaustion of her past and the uncertainty of her future. She knew it would take years to bring it back to life, but she also knew that every nail she hammered, every board she replaced, was an act of reclamation. The house was not just lumber and plaster. It was her refusal to let anyone else dictate the value of her life. And for a little while, in that fragile calm before the storm, she allowed herself to believe she could remain invisible, just another homeowner tending to her corner of the world, untouched by the conflicts she had unknowingly invited into her new beginning. The first weeks in the new house passed in a haze of quiet labor, and although Rachel could feel the suspicion in the air whenever she crossed paths with her neighbors, she remained focused on the slow transformation taking place within the walls of her home. Then came the morning that shattered the fragile rhythm she had begun to build. She awoke early, the light filtering pale and cold through the threadbare curtains, and went to fetch the mail. At first, her mind was still fixed on a sketch she had left unfinished on the table the night before, lines of roof angles and window frames waiting for refinement. But when she opened the front door, her eyes froze on the wall beside it. Someone had written across the siding in thick, dripping black paint, letters large enough to be seen from the street. The word stood out like a wound. Slum. The letters bled downward in uneven streaks, running along the wood as though the house itself had been branded with shame. Rachel felt her chest tighten. For several seconds she could not move, could not even draw breath, as though the sight itself had robbed her of air. She stepped closer, hoping she had misread, that perhaps it was some meaningless graffiti, but the insult was clear, deliberate, positioned directly by the entrance where every visitor would see it. The first rush of disbelief gave way to anger, sharp and cold, and she turned instinctively toward the street. No one was there, but she felt the weight of curtains shifting behind the neat windows across the lane, neighbors peeking out to watch her discover the mark. She imagined their murmurs, confirmation, perhaps, that the outsider, the quiet woman with the crumbling house, truly did not belong here. For a moment she considered grabbing a bucket of water and a rag, scrubbing until her arms burned, but she knew paint like this did not yield so easily. It was oil-based, chosen with care, meant to sink into wood and resist removal. Whoever had done it wanted the word to linger, wanted her to live with it, to see it every time she left her house, to feel humiliated not just in private but under the eyes of the community. Rachel's thoughts leapt unbidden to Karen Thompson, the neighbor whose clipped voice she had overheard more than once carrying across the hedges, lamenting the state of Rachel's house. Karen, with her meticulously arranged garden and spotless shutters, the kind of woman who carried herself as though she were the unofficial governor of the street. Karen, who had once approached Rachel in passing and, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, remarked that a place like yours can really drag down a block if it's not handled quickly. Rachel had nodded politely at the time, unwilling to confront her, but now the connection blazed in her mind. The style of the attack, its precision, its malice, it felt unmistakably hers. She forced herself to step back inside and dial the police, her hand trembling slightly as she spoke to the dispatcher, describing the vandalism. When the patrol car arrived half an hour later, 2 officers surveyed the wall with neutral expressions, one of them jotting notes, the other photographing the word with a small camera. Rachel tried to explain the context, her suspicions, the hostility she had sensed, but she felt their skepticism almost immediately. They asked whether she had enemies, whether she had argued with anyone recently, whether perhaps the act was random. Their tone was not cruel, but it carried the faint detachment of people who had seen too many petty disputes spiral out of control. When she mentioned Karen by name, the younger officer glanced at his partner and then back at Rachel with a raised brow, as though suggesting that accusing a neighbor without evidence might not be wise. Karen herself emerged while they were still there, stepping gracefully down her driveway with a mug of coffee in hand, her robe neatly tied, her expression one of concerned curiosity. She approached the small gathering with the ease of someone confident in her standing, and when she saw the word on Rachel's wall, she gasped audibly. "My goodness," she said, shaking her head slowly. "What a terrible thing to happen. This neighborhood has always been so safe. I hope you're not trying to suggest that any of us would do such a thing." The officers glanced at Rachel, waiting for her reaction, and Rachel felt the trap tighten. Karen's performance was flawless. Her tone carried just the right amount of shock, her eyes radiated feigned sympathy, yet there was a flicker of something else there, something sharp and satisfied, almost hidden behind the mask. The police took their notes, advised Rachel to file a report at the station, and then departed with the practiced neutrality of men unwilling to take sides in suburban skirmishes. Rachel stood on her porch as their car pulled away, the word slum still glaring beside her, and Karen lingered just long enough to murmur, low enough for Rachel alone to hear, "You know, sometimes it helps to keep a property presentable." People wouldn't get ideas if things looked cared for. With that, she turned and strolled back to her perfect home, leaving Rachel seething. That night, Rachel sat in the dim front room, staring at the crude black letters through the window. She thought of all the work she had poured into the house, of the sketches pinned to the walls, of the quiet evenings she had imagined would belong to her here, and she felt them all tainted by that single act. She began to wonder not just about Karen, but about the others. Had someone watched and laughed as the paint was sprayed across her wall? Had they cheered it as justice for daring to bring her worn-down house into their pristine world? The paranoia crept slowly, settling in her chest. She realized this was more than vandalism. It was a declaration, a message that she was being measured and found unworthy. And for the first time since moving in, she felt that perhaps the house was not a sanctuary after all, but a battleground she had not chosen yet could no longer ignore. Rachel tried to wash the word away the following morning, scrubbing until her arms ached and her hands burned from the chemicals, but the paint had sunk deep into the siding and only smeared into a darker stain that seemed to mock her with every attempt. She covered the spot with a tarp temporarily, yet she knew it was no solution, and the humiliation continued to sting each time she glimpsed the shadow of those letters beneath the cloth. When she stepped outside later in the day to carry debris to the curb, she noticed Karen speaking with two neighbors at the end of the street, their voices low but their glances sharp and unmistakably directed at her. She caught fragments carried by the breeze, phrases like attention-seeking, wants a payout, and always some drama. Rachel's stomach twisted. The narrative was already being written, not by her, but by Karen, and it was spreading quickly like rot beneath the surface of the block. Within days, she began to sense the shift more openly. Where once neighbors had greeted her with polite nods or shallow smiles, they now averted their eyes or looked her over with veiled suspicion. One woman she had spoken with occasionally while checking the mail no longer returned her wave. Another man across the street, who had once offered to lend her tools, now closed his garage door whenever she came outside, the metallic slam echoing like a verdict. The message was clear. She had been marked, not just on her wall but in the collective judgment of the neighborhood, and the mark was not fading. Karen, for her part, grew bolder. She began to make offhand remarks whenever Rachel was within earshot, her voice pitched just high enough to carry. "Some people thrive on victimhood," she said one afternoon while watering her roses, a neighbor nodding beside her. "They'll even deface their own property if it gets them sympathy." Rachel froze, her back stiff as she hauled a bag of old shingles from the porch, but she forced herself not to respond, knowing that any reaction would be twisted against her. The silence, however, gave Karen more room to maneuver, and soon Rachel heard more rumors whispered on sidewalks and muttered at the community mailbox. That she had moved into the neighborhood only to file lawsuits, that she had exaggerated the vandalism for attention, that perhaps she had financial problems and wanted the city to declare her house unsafe so she could escape the mortgage. Each lie cut deeper because it spread so easily, and Rachel realized that her natural reserve, the very quietness she had always relied on to shield her, now worked against her. In the absence of her voice, Karen's voice became the only truth. The psychological toll grew heavier. Rachel found herself waking in the middle of the night at the sound of footsteps that never materialized, shadows that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of the curtains. Once she heard the metallic clang of her garbage can tipping over, and in the morning trash was scattered across the driveway, the lid rolled into the street. She picked it up with shaking hands, convinced it was no accident. Another evening, she returned home to find a stack of unsolicited pamphlets shoved aggressively into her mailbox, each one advertising foreclosure relief or distressed property solutions. She knew they were not there by chance. Someone wanted her to believe that others already saw her house as a failing asset. But the most chilling moment came when she spotted Karen standing directly at the edge of her lawn one early morning. Rachel had risen with the sun to sketch before the day grew too hot, and when she glanced through the window she saw her neighbor, perfectly dressed, staring intently at the house as though measuring it for demolition. Karen did not smile, did not wave, did not even flinch when Rachel stepped onto the porch. She simply turned after a long pause and walked slowly back to her own property, her movements calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The message was unmistakable. I am watching you, and I am not finished. Rachel knew she could not endure this campaign of isolation indefinitely. She began to research protective measures, reading late into the night about property disputes, civil harassment, and the rights of homeowners against defamation. She considered buying security cameras, though the thought of surveilling her own home unsettled her. Yet the situation escalated further when she received a formal envelope from the Homeowners Association, stamped with their emblem. The letter inside claimed that her property had been the subject of multiple complaints citing neglect, safety hazards, and unsightly conditions detrimental to the neighborhood. The accusations were phrased with bureaucratic detachment, but the weight of them was immense. If upheld, the HOA could impose fines, even pursue action against her occupancy. Rachel's hands shook as she held the pages, the words blurring. She knew exactly whose hand was behind the complaints. She tried to rally her strength, reminding herself that she was not powerless. As an architect, she understood zoning, inspections, permits, the language of property codes. She gathered her records, proof of the repairs she had made, receipts for materials, inspection reports from the purchase, and began drafting a response. Yet even as she worked, she felt the futility pressing in. For each document she prepared, Karen was already whispering to someone else, twisting the story, painting her not as a homeowner fighting to restore a house but as a nuisance threatening the entire street. Rachel had once believed the house would stand as her shield, but now it felt like a fortress under siege, every wall vulnerable to the relentless erosion of lies. It was in that fragile state, teetering between defiance and despair, that Rachel realized she could no longer dismiss Karen as a meddling neighbor with too much time. This was strategy, a deliberate escalation designed to crush her resolve. The graffiti had been only the opening blow, a scar she could not erase, and everything that followed was meant to tighten the noose. The rumors, the petty vandalism, the formal complaints. Karen was not waiting for her to fail. She was orchestrating the failure, step by step, until the house itself became untenable. And for the first time, Rachel understood that if she did not find a way to strike back, to reclaim not only her home but her name, she would be consumed by the story being written about her. The escalation was not just external, it was inside her too, building pressure, hardening resolve, whispering that silence was no longer an option. The envelope arrived without fanfare, slipped into her mailbox between a grocery store flyer and an electricity bill. Yet when Rachel tore it open, she felt her stomach plummet, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her feet. Inside was a packet of papers bearing the letterhead of the city's Department of Building Safety, stamped and marked with the kind of official language designed to intimidate. According to the notice, her home had been flagged for potential condemnation due to structural instability, neglect, and failure to comply with municipal standards. It cited specific sections of code, the kind that sounded grave even when taken out of context, and concluded with a warning that failure to remediate could result in her eviction. Rachel sat at her dining table, the late afternoon sun slanting across the pages, and read the words again and again, her mind caught between disbelief and fury. She had purchased the house only months before, and while it was in disrepair, it had passed inspection, however narrowly, and nothing in her work since then could have transformed it into a hazard. The language of the document was precise, But as she studied it, something began to unravel. The inspector's name at the bottom of the page, signed in hurried script, triggered a faint memory. She rose from her chair, went to the small filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out the thick folder that contained all of the closing paperwork from her purchase. Flipping through the sheets, she found what she was looking for: the city inspection report from that very department. The name of the inspector was identical, but the date was not. The man whose signature adorned her new notice had been retired for nearly 2 years before she ever purchased the property, and she remembered the realtor mentioning in passing that he had died shortly afterward. A chill ran through her as she compared the signatures side by side. They were similar, but not identical. The new one was stiffer, the kind of forgery created by someone tracing rather than writing naturally. Her hands trembled as she spread the papers across the table, aligning them with the precision of her architectural mind. The letterhead itself was outdated, bearing the older city logo that had been replaced 18 months ago. The codes cited were also out of alignment with the most recent revisions she had reviewed as part of her professional work. Whoever had fabricated the documents had done so with enough surface accuracy to deceive a casual glance, but had overlooked the finer details, the kind of discrepancies only someone familiar with the language of building regulations would recognize. Rachel leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingers against her temples, the realization pressing harder than the air in the room. This was not an act of bureaucratic oversight. It was intentional, deliberate falsification designed to intimidate her into believing her house could be taken from her. And there was only one person who stood to gain from such a ploy. Karen's face rose in her mind, perfectly made up, her voice laced with mock sympathy the day the police had visited. The precision of the graffiti, the escalation into neighborhood gossip, and now this. Each step felt like part of a larger scheme, but the forged notice elevated it from harassment to something darker, something with consequences beyond whispered rumors. Rachel imagined what would have happened if she had not been an architect, if she had simply accepted the document at face value, too frightened to question it. She might already be packing her belongings, surrendering her home under the weight of fraudulent authority. The thought made her blood run cold. Karen was not merely cruel, she was dangerous, wielding deception like a weapon, willing to manipulate systems of power to erase someone she considered undesirable. Rachel considered taking the notice directly to the city office, but caution tempered her impulse. If Karen had gone so far as to fabricate government documents, then exposing the fraud without preparation could risk retaliation she was not ready to withstand. Instead, she photographed the papers carefully, cataloged each page with her notes, and stored the originals in a locked drawer. The architect in her approached the situation the way she would a complex project. Identify the flaws, build the case, prepare the presentation. She began drafting a timeline of events, from the vandalism to the spreading rumors to the HOA complaints, and now the falsified condemnation notice. Each incident by itself could be dismissed as unfortunate or circumstantial, but together they formed a pattern, a clear trajectory of escalation aimed squarely at her destruction. Yet the discovery also sparked something unexpected within her, a flare of resolve that burned against the fear. For weeks she had felt trapped, shrinking under the weight of whispers, afraid to defend herself lest she appear combative. But now the evidence was tangible. The falsified notice was not an opinion or a rumor. It was proof of malice, and proof could be used, wielded in ways Karen might not anticipate. That night, Rachel sat in her dimly lit living room, the papers spread before her like pieces of a crime scene, and felt her anger solidify into strategy. She would not surrender the house. She would not give Karen the satisfaction of watching her retreat. The game had shifted, and if Karen wanted to fight on the terrain of forged authority, Rachel would bring real authority into the light. The following morning, Rachel made her way to the Department of Building Safety in person, carrying both the forged documents and her originals. The clerk at the counter, a weary woman with glasses perched low on her nose, listened with mild curiosity as Rachel explained her concern. When Rachel slid the papers across the counter, the woman's expression shifted from routine boredom to sharp focus. She disappeared into a back office, returning minutes later with a supervisor. Together, they examined the pages, comparing them with the department's official seals and databases, and within half an hour, Rachel had confirmation. The notice was a forgery. The supervisor's tone was clipped but not unsympathetic as he explained that falsifying government documents was a serious offense, potentially criminal, and that Rachel should consider filing a report with the police. He promised to provide her with a letter certifying the forgery, should she need to defend herself against any claims stemming from it. Rachel left the office with the letter clutched tightly in her hand, relief and dread warring in her chest. Relief that she was not imagining the attack, dread at what it meant about the lengths Karen was willing to pursue. That evening, as Rachel stood on her porch watching the sunset bleed across the neat rooftops of the block, she felt both exposed and emboldened. Karen passed by on her way back from a neighbor's house, her posture graceful as ever, her smile faintly smug. Rachel held her gaze, for once refusing to look away, and in that brief, silent exchange she knew that Karen understood she had not succeeded in breaking her. The battle was far from over, but for the first time Rachel felt that she held a weapon of her own. The truth, documented and undeniable. What she did with it remained uncertain, yet the knowledge itself was power, and power was the one thing Karen had never intended for her to possess. The forged notice should have been the breaking point, the moment where Karen realized she had overstepped, but instead it became the spark that fueled her into an even more aggressive campaign, as if Rachel's refusal to bend under the weight of fraud was an insult she could not tolerate. Within a week, the neighborhood began to shift in ways Rachel had not anticipated, subtle gestures that grew sharper with each passing day. Where once she had endured whispers and sideways glances, now she saw open hostility. Cars slowed as they passed her house, drivers staring with undisguised disdain. A group of neighbors who used to gather casually on Saturday mornings at the corner cafe no longer greeted her when she walked by but turned their backs in unison, their conversation dropping to low, conspiratorial murmurs. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, unsigned but clearly coordinated, describing concerns about declining property values due to negligence on Willow Lane, and urging residents to demand stricter enforcement from the HOA. Though no names were mentioned, the implication was unmistakable, and Rachel knew who the target was meant to be. Karen had weaponized the community, turning it into a chorus of suspicion. But she did not stop there. One afternoon, Rachel heard a heavy knock at her door, and when she opened it, a man in a gray polo shirt with no insignia stood there holding a clipboard. His tone was brusque, his stance invasive, as he announced that he was there to conduct an urgent inspection for gas leaks. Rachel, wary after the forgery incident, asked to see identification, but he brushed her off, insisting that his presence was mandatory and that refusal to admit him could result in serious consequences. Rachel's pulse quickened as she blocked the doorway, repeating her demand. The man's face tightened with irritation, and for a moment she thought he might push past her. But after a tense silence, he stepped back, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, climbing into an unmarked van that idled at the curb. Rachel stood frozen, watching as the vehicle pulled away, her hands trembling. It had been a bluff, a performance designed to frighten her into surrendering access. Later, she would learn that the man was a former contractor who had once done landscaping for Karen, a man with a history of aggressive debt collection tactics. Karen had recruited him as a tool, sending him to impersonate authority in order to rattle her further. The harassment grew more intimate after that. Rachel began finding anonymous notes slipped under her door at night, typed in block letters telling her to sell before it's too late, or warning that unsafe houses don't last long. Twice she woke to find her porch light unscrewed and the bulb shattered on the ground. A quiet violation that chilled her more than overt vandalism because it meant someone had walked directly up to her door in the dark. Her trash cans were overturned so often that she stopped placing them neatly on the curb, instead dragging them out at the last possible moment. Yet still she would find garbage strewn across her yard as if to mark her as the neighborhood's pariah. The petty cruelty was relentless, but beneath it lay the unmistakable structure of strategy. Karen was dismantling her piece by piece, not with a single blow but with a steady rhythm of pressure designed to sap her will. Rachel fought back in the only way she knew, meticulously documenting every incident, photographing the shattered light bulbs, saving the notes, cataloging the time she saw Karen lingering at the edge of her property. She told herself that evidence mattered, that if this went to court or to the police again, she would need more than suspicions. Yet the act of gathering proof did not erase the psychological toll. She felt her world shrinking, her movements dictated by the need to anticipate the next attack. The house, once a project of hope, now felt more like a bunker where she waited for assaults she could not prevent. Even her work suffered. The architectural sketches that once flowed easily from her pencil now stalled in stiff, incomplete lines, her concentration fractured by the constant awareness of being watched. The culmination came when the HOA itself formally summoned her to a hearing. The notice accused her of violating multiple community standards: failure to maintain her lawn, failure to address structural hazards, even creating a nuisance through the encouragement of neighborhood unrest. The language was so brazenly tilted that Rachel could almost see Karen's hand guiding the pen, and though she knew she had the forged documents and the city's certification to expose the fraud, she also knew the battle was no longer limited to evidence. It was about perception, about who the community believed, and Karen had spent months weaving her narrative. Rachel entered the meeting hall that evening to find the room thick with neighbors, their faces taut with suspicion, their whispers buzzing like static. Karen sat near the front, her posture immaculate, her smile faint but triumphant, as if she were already savoring the verdict. Rachel presented her records, calmly explaining the renovations she had undertaken, the receipts for repairs, the official letter from the Department of Building Safety confirming the forgery. She spoke clearly, refusing to let her voice falter, and for a moment she saw doubt flicker in the eyes of a few board members. But Karen rose with theatrical timing, producing photographs of Rachel's house taken at unflattering angles, emphasizing every unfinished repair, every patch of peeling paint, and then launching into a speech about the duty of the HOA to protect property values from negligence. Her words dripped with false concern, portraying herself as a guardian of the neighborhood forced into conflict by Rachel's irresponsibility. By the end of her performance, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Rachel knew that truth alone would not be enough to sway hearts already poisoned by months of rumor. Leaving the hall, she felt the walls closing in. Karen had mobilized not just individuals but the entire machinery of neighborhood authority, using forged documents, intimidation, and public spectacle to isolate her. The escalation was complete. This was no longer a feud between two women, but a full campaign to erase her presence from the street. Yet beneath the despair flickered a harder flame. Rachel realized that she had reached the point where defense was not enough. Karen would not stop until she was broken, and the only way to survive was to strike back in a way that would expose her enemy fully, leaving no room for doubt, no ground for retreat. The escalation had become unbearable, but in that unbearable pressure Rachel felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. The day of the hearing in county court arrived heavy with anticipation, the kind of morning where even the air seemed to carry weight. And Rachel walked through the doors knowing that this moment would decide not only the fate of her house, but the future of her life in the neighborhood. She had gathered every document, every photograph, every note, carrying them in a worn leather portfolio that felt heavier than its physical mass, as though the burden of months of fear and humiliation had been distilled into paper and ink. Her cousin, David Myers, a circuit judge with a reputation for unflinching fairness, had recused himself from presiding directly over the case but had ensured that the matter was given full and proper attention in front of one of his trusted colleagues, and he sat quietly in the gallery, his presence a reminder that she was not alone. Karen entered the courtroom like a woman stepping onto a stage, her hair immaculately styled, her blazer pressed, her expression composed into the perfect mask of civic responsibility. She carried her own stack of documents, and when she saw Rachel already seated at the plaintiff's table, she allowed herself the faintest smile, as if to remind her that appearances often mattered more than truth. The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney presenting the complaint, a litany of alleged violations delivered in clipped tones, painting Rachel's house as a hazard and her presence as a threat to the community. Photographs were displayed on the screen, each one carefully chosen to show the property in the worst possible light. Shadows accentuating peeling paint, weeds caught in mid-growth, a tarp sagging across a section of roof. The attorney spoke of declining property values, of concerned neighbors, of the need for decisive action to preserve the neighborhood's integrity. Murmurs of approval rose from the small crowd of residents who had attended, many of them Karen's allies, their faces tense with the righteous certainty of people convinced they were defending their way of life. When it was Rachel's turn, she stood slowly, her knees unsteady but her voice firm, and she began not with excuses but with evidence. She presented the official inspection report from the time of her purchase, confirming the house had met all requirements. She laid out receipts for repairs completed, permits obtained, and plans for further restoration. Then she introduced the letter from the Department of Building Safety, signed by the supervisor who had verified that the supposed condemnation notice was a forgery. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as the words were read aloud. Falsified documentation, misuse of government insignia, potential criminal liability. Rachel explained how the document had been delivered to her mailbox and how its details betrayed its falsehood. She produced the side-by-side comparison of signatures, the outdated letterhead, the obsolete codes cited, and as she spoke she felt the weight of truth settle tangibly into the room, undeniable and precise. Karen's mask began to slip. Her attorney attempted to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge allowed the evidence, noting that if fraudulent documents had been circulated to influence HOA decisions, then the credibility of the entire complaint was compromised. Rachel pressed on, describing the unmarked man who had come to her door demanding entry. The anonymous notes slipped under her threshold, the vandalism that had branded her house with humiliation. She did not embellish, did not cry or raise her voice, but laid the facts bare with the measured cadence of someone who had endured too much to be dismissed any longer. By the time she finished, silence hung heavy across the room, the murmurs gone, replaced by the uneasy recognition that this was no simple dispute between neighbors, but something far darker. Then Karen rose, abandoning her calm facade and launching into a tirade about Rachel's supposed neglect and dishonesty. Her words came too quickly, her tone shrill where it had once been smooth, and when she insisted that she had never seen the forged notice before, Rachel's attorney produced the damning detail. The watermark on the paper matched a batch Karen had. Purchased from a local office supply store, her transaction recorded by the store's ledger. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen stammered, tried to pivot, claimed harassment, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The judge's expression hardened as he reminded her that falsifying government documents was a felony, and that presenting them in an official HOA proceeding could carry severe consequences. By the time the ruling was delivered, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The complaint against Rachel was dismissed in full, declared malicious and unsupported. The court recognized the evidence of harassment and intimidation and referred the matter for further investigation. Karen was ordered to pay damages for defamation, vandalism, and emotional distress, and though she tried to protest, the words of the judgment drowned her voice. In the gallery, David Myers allowed himself the faintest nod, his eyes meeting Rachel's with pride and relief. Rachel herself sat motionless for a moment, her hands clasped tightly on the table, her breath shallow as the enormity of the moment washed over her. She had endured the whispers, the isolation, the staged inspections and the forged condemnations, and she had survived. More than that, she had exposed Karen for what she truly was, stripping away the mask of neighborly concern to reveal the cruelty beneath. As she left the courthouse, the late afternoon sun blazing against the steps, Rachel felt something she had not felt in months. Unburdened. The battle was not only won, but transformed. No longer a private war between two women, but a public reckoning that would ripple through the neighborhood long after the gavel had struck. Karen, once untouchable in her posture of authority, had been dragged into the light, and the consequences of that exposure were only beginning. The weeks that followed the trial carried with them a strange quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has ripped through and left the landscape altered beyond recognition. For the first time since moving to Willow Lane, Rachel felt that she could walk out her front door without bracing herself for some fresh humiliation, no longer anticipating the sharp sting of eyes measuring her as though she were an intruder in her own home. Karen's downfall had been swift once the ruling became known. The fines and damages imposed were more than she could manage, her reputation among the HOA shattered beyond repair, and as investigators began to dig into the forgeries and the manipulations that had propped up her authority for years, the facade of control she had so carefully cultivated crumbled. Neighbors who had once whispered in agreement with her began to distance themselves, speaking in lowered tones about how they had suspected something all along, their loyalty evaporating now that exposure carried consequence. Within 2 months, Karen's house was seized to settle debts she could no longer conceal, her belongings scattered across the driveway in cardboard boxes that wilted under the morning dew. Rachel passed by once, slowly, on her way back from the hardware store, and saw Karen standing among the wreckage, her immaculate composure gone, her clothes wrinkled, her face lined with exhaustion that even makeup could not disguise. For a fleeting moment, Rachel felt a pang of pity, the kind that arises when an enemy is reduced to something almost pitiably human. But it passed quickly, replaced by the steady recognition that cruelty had brought her here, not misfortune. Karen left the neighborhood soon after, and no one seemed to know or care where she had gone. Her name became a cautionary murmur rather than a weapon, a reminder of how far someone could fall when consumed by spite. Rachel turned her focus back to the house, peeling away the tarp that had hidden the scar of the word slum and sanding the boards until the last trace of black paint had vanished. She repainted the siding in soft shades of cream, each stroke a reclamation, and when the work was finished, she stood in the yard and looked up at the clean surface with something close to awe. The house no longer felt like a battleground but a home, a place that bore the marks of struggle yet carried them as proof of survival rather than shame. Slowly, some neighbors began to greet her again, hesitant but genuine, their previous silence shifting into quiet respect. She did not forget the months of isolation, nor did she forgive easily, but she accepted their gestures with measured grace, knowing that rebuilding trust was as much a part of her project as restoring the wood and plaster. One evening, as the sun fell low and the air filled with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecues, Rachel sat on her porch with her sketchbook resting on her lap. She opened to a fresh page, the blank space waiting to be filled, and for the first time in months her hand moved freely, lines flowing without hesitation. She realized then that the battle for the house had never been only about walls or property lines, but about the right to exist without bending to the cruelty of others. She had defended that right, and though the cost had been heavy, the reward was unmistakable. The house stood strong, no longer a mark of disgrace but a testament to her resilience, and she knew she would never look at it again without remembering that she had faced malice and endured. The word that once branded her home had been erased, and in its place stood not just paint but something far stronger: permanence, dignity, and the quiet strength of someone who had refused to be broken.